ever ponder how we argue? Like what actually makes an argument sound or not? I mean, as philosophers, it's kind of at the heart of what we do, right? So today we're going somewhere really interesting and I think unexpected.
Yeah, we are. A journey across cultures and centuries. We're diving deep into how these questions, the very foundations of logic, were explored in classical India.
I think our listeners will be surprised by what we find, actually.
Yeah, I think so too. We'll be tracing the evolution of logic in India from its early connections with discussions about, well, about being and knowing, to the development of really complex and formal systems of reasoning.
And lucky for us, there's this huge and rich collection of ancient texts.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Early philosophical works, the Buddhist canon, those later classical treatises, they're all there waiting for us to dig in.
Exactly. And as philosophers, I mean, you all are probably wrestling with these principles of reasoning right now in your own work, trying to figure out how to make a sound argument.
All the time.
So our mission today is to kind of unpack how thinkers in India centuries ago faced these same challenges. And what's fascinating, I think, is that we'll discover both those familiar concepts, things we recognize from our own tradition, and some really different approaches.
Yeah, it's really striking. And what's so interesting from our perspective as philosophers is that this development of logic, it wasn't just this isolated thing. It was influenced by all these different areas of thought. Ontology, so the nature of what exists, epistemology, how we know things, dialectics, even early forms of looking at language.
So it was really integrated with all these other philosophical inquiries.
Totally, though it's worth pointing out that language itself wasn't the primary focus in the way it later became in the West. That's a difference that really jumps out at you.
Right, so let's rewind the clock way back to the pre-classical period in India. We're talking roughly 5th century BCE to the beginning of the Common Era. Now, it's super important to make this distinction right off the bat. There's the act of reasoning itself, something we humans do naturally, I mean, we can't help it. And then there's the process of actually reflecting on that reasoning, figuring out what makes it good or bad.
Right, like taking a step back and analyzing what we're already doing.
And we're going to be looking at both. How reasoning practices evolved kind of organically during this period, and then how those principles of logic were articulated explicitly later on.
Exactly. And what we see taking shape in this pre-classical period is a real commitment to this idea of rational inquiry, a real search for those underlying reasons behind the ideas they held.
So it wasn't just about accepting what had always been believed.
Not at all. They were really digging into those reasons. And crucially, those reasons were then subject to this public scrutiny. It wasn't happening in isolation.
And this public aspect is so interesting. We get these hints of it in the Upanishads, and then, wow, we have these detailed accounts in the Buddhist canons.
Oh yeah, these public verbal exchanges were really a big deal. And it's important to note that they weren't always these formal debates in the sense that we might think of them today.
So what were they like, these exchanges?
Well, they included formal instruction, especially in Buddhist philosophy, but also these more informal, almost verbal sparring matches. A lot of times it was a question and answer format where how well someone could express their views was a big part of it. You had to be persuasive, show authority, and similes and analogies, they were really key to making an argument convincing.
So those tools of rhetoric really mattered.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Formal, deductively structured arguments, as we might define them today, they weren't as common. It was more about this back and forth.
Right. And these exchanges, they seem to have followed a recognizable pattern, didn't they?
Yeah, they did pretty consistently.
Typically, there'd be this central figure, often the Buddha, whose authority was established.
Right. And then you'd have an opponent, they'd have their own credentials.
Yeah, and the whole thing took place in a specific setting with an audience.
A formal greeting.
The opponent would present their challenge, and then
a refutation. The Buddhist viewpoint would be established.
Sometimes a hypothetical scenario to make the point even clearer.
Yeah, and then at the end, the opponent's surrender, and sometimes in some accounts, a recognition or reward. It really paints this vivid picture of a lively intellectual scene.
It does. And if we zoom out a bit to get that bigger picture for our philosopher listeners, there were also these public assemblies called pariyat or sabha. These were gatherings where they deliberated on, practical stuff, administrative, legal, and religious matters.
Right, and what's really significant here is that a lot of the legal vocabulary from these assemblies, it actually made its way into the later philosophical discussions about debate and argumentation.
Wow, so there was this real crossover between those practical deliberations and the more abstract philosophical inquiry into reasoning itself.
Exactly, a real flow of ideas back and forth.
And we shouldn't forget that during this pre-classical period, rational inquiry wasn't limited to just philosophy in the narrow sense.
Oh, not at all. It was happening all over the place. Agriculture, architecture, astronomy, grammar, law, early forms of logic, mathematics, medicine, even studying sound with phonology, and then statecraft. It was a really intellectually vibrant environment.
It's amazing. And it's interesting, while we have Panini's grammar, the Attidae, from this period, dedicated treatises on most of these other subjects, they don't actually come from this early time.
That's right, but scholars generally agree that those foundational versions of texts in these areas, they were being developed, put together by the start of the Common Era.
So even though we don't have direct textual evidence in some areas, we know that intellectual foundation was being laid.
Absolutely, the seeds were planted.
Now, to really understand the history of reasoning in this pre-classical period, there are these 3 late canonical Buddhist texts that are especially insightful.
Oh yeah, these are key. The Kathavatu, meaning points of controversy, the Yamaka, which translates to couplets, and then Milindapanya, or questions of King Milinda.
And these are all from around the 3rd century BCE, part of the Theravada Buddhist tradition. So let's start with the Yamaka. What makes this text so relevant for our understanding of early logic?
Well, it's all in the structure. The Yamaka is part of the Bhāvatamapiyaka, and it's organized into these 10 chapters. Each chapter presents these pairs of questions, and they're exploring whether universal categorical propositions are true for different concepts.
Okay, so to break that down, could you give us an example?
Sure. So you know how we talked about matter, M, aggregate A, matter aggregate, MA, and sensation aggregate, SA.
Right, those basic Buddhist concepts.
Yeah. Right. So the Yamaka asks questions like, are all MMA? And then flips it, are all MAM? And they do this with all kinds of conceptual pairings. So even though there aren't these explicitly laid out formal arguments, the way they systematically ask the same kind of question about different concepts, it suggests that they were already aware of logical form, at least intuitively. And that's a really important insight that paved the way for those later developments in logic.
So they might not have been consciously articulating it, but that idea was already present.
Yeah, exactly. And here's something else that's really interesting for us as philosophers. While the Yamaka has this clear system to it, scholars still debate its exact logical purpose. It seems to be an exploration of the relationships between those fundamental Buddhist concepts, but through this really consistent linguistic lens.
So playing with language to probe those deeper philosophical ideas.
Yeah, and we even see hints of contrapositives in these paired questions, almost like they're unconsciously grasping some of those logical relationships between different propositions.
Wow, okay, now on to the Kathavathu. This one's also part of the Theravada Abhidhamma, but it's different from the Yamaka in a key way, right?
Oh yeah, big time. The Kathavatu actually lays out arguments. It aims to show that the propositions held by other schools of thought, schools that didn't agree with the Theravada perspective, actually had inconsistencies. It tackles about 200 of them.
So they're really going head-to-head with these opposing views.
Yes, but what's important for understanding how logic was developing is that they present these arguments in a really recognizable, almost like a standard format. There might not have been explicit discussion about the meaning and truth of propositions, what philosophers call semantic assent, but you can see this clear pattern in the arguments.
I see, a kind of implicit logic at work. Can you give us an example?
Absolutely. There's this classic example in the debate with the Pudgalavadins about the soul. The Theravada asks, is the soul known truly and ultimately? And the Pudgalavadin says yes. Then the Theravada follows up with, is the soul known truly and ultimately just like any other ultimate fact? To which the Pudgalavadin replies, no. So the Theravada points out this apparent contradiction, saying, well, if the soul is known truly and ultimately, then you should also say it's known just like any other ultimate fact.
So they're highlighting an inconsistency in the Pudgalavadin's position.
Exactly. And if we break down this argument, the general form is something like this. Is A B? Yes. Is C D? No. Therefore, if A is B, then C is D. What the text seems to be doing is showing that it's not consistent to say A is B, but deny that C is D. And it's also working with this idea of the contrapositive. If C is not D, then A is not B.
Okay, so what can we as philosophers take away from this?
Well, even without a fully formalized theory of logic, the Kathavathu shows us that the idea of logical consistency was already there. And they're implicitly relying on the validity of the contrapositive, a really fundamental idea in logical inference.
Right, fascinating. Okay, finally, let's talk about the Milindapanya. The Questions of King Milinda. This one is a dialogue, right?
It is, yeah. A dialogue between King Linda, a Greek Bactrian king, and this highly respected Buddhist monk named Nagasena. And while it does have some argumentation, it's mainly focused on explaining Buddhist doctrine and practice.
So a kind of teaching tool.
You could say that, yeah. But what makes the Milindapanha unique in terms of logic is how it uses these elaborate analogies. I mean, it's analogies all the way down.
Mm-hmm.
For example, there's this part where they're talking about inference, and King Milinda argues that the Buddha couldn't have existed because neither Nagasena nor his teachers had actually seen him.
So he's challenging the basis for belief in the Buddha.
Right, and Nagasena counters this with a whole bunch of analogies. He asks King Milinda if he believes in the founder of his own royal lineage, even though he hasn't seen them. And he argues that his belief is based on those royal insignia, those symbols that prove the lineage is real.
Ah, so he's making this connection.
Exactly. Nagasena says that the Buddha's teachings are like his royal insignia, and that's how we can know he existed, even without having seen him.
I see, clever.
And what's really striking for us, from a logic perspective, is how central this analogical reasoning is. He uses analogies for everything. A grand city implies a designer, big waves mean a vast ocean, a large elephant footprint tells you there's a large elephant, and on and on.
And these analogies, they all kind of share that same structure as what later became formalized as anumana, or inference.
Precisely. And they're also pointing to this underlying principle, the idea of non-contradiction. You can really see that in the section called Solving the Dilemmas, where King Milinda brings up statements that seem to contradict each other.
Oh, I remember that part. Can you remind us of an example?
Sure. So there's this apparent contradiction. The Buddha said that all men tremble at punishment and fear death, right? So how can an arhat, an enlightened being who's supposed to have transcended all fear, be said to be a man?
A real head-scratcher.
Right. But Nagasena clears it up by explaining that the intended meaning isn't always literal or universal. He gives examples of how the word all is often used in a specific context and doesn't actually include absolutely everyone.
Oh, right, like a king telling his ministers all must pay taxes.
Exactly, the ministers aren't paying taxes. So you see, even in these early texts, they're not directly focused on formal logic, but those early seeds of logical thinking are definitely there. They're thinking about consistency, they have this implicit understanding of how inferences work, and they're really leaning on analogical reasoning. All of this will later be systematized and formalized, but the groundwork is being laid.
So moving on now to the classical period. This is roughly from the 1st to the 6th century CE. A really significant shift happens in this period, right?
Absolutely. This is when we start to see those systematic philosophical treatises and a real intense focus on the nature of argumentation itself.
Right, and as we said before, this is when we see that recognizable canonical form of argument start to emerge. But it wasn't always this smooth, direct path. There are some really interesting texts that use lots of arguments, but don't explicitly lay out those principles of argument or inference in a theoretical way.
Yeah, we're talking about those early polemical writings of some really influential thinkers, like Nagarjuna and Aryadeva. Some of the key works here are Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamakakarika, Vigrahayavarkani, and Vaidalya Prakaran. And then we have Aryadeva's Shatehastra.
Okay, lots of names and titles there. Can you break down what makes some of these works stand out?
Well, the Vigrahayavartana, which you can translate as refutation of objections or exclusion of disputes, is super helpful for understanding the reasoning of this time.
Why is that?
Well, because we actually have Nagarjuna's own commentary on it in Sanskrit.
Ah, so we get a direct look into his thought process.
Exactly. In verses 31 to 50, his main goal is to show that any attempt to establish pramas, those reliable means of gaining knowledge, ends up in contradiction or infinite regress.
Classic philosophical problems, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. And he looks at two main scenarios. Either pramanas are justified by other pramas, or each one is somehow self-established.
So in that first scenario, if you need another pramada to validate the first one and so on, you end up in this infinite chain, right?
Exactly, with no solid foundation.
Makes sense. And what about that second scenario, the self-establishing pramada?
So in that case, Nagarjuna asks, well, why should pramadas have this special ability to eliminate themselves? His opponent suggests that light also has this property because it can eliminate other things and itself. But Nagarjuna brings up some arguments to challenge this analogy.
So he's questioning whether that analogy actually holds up.
Yeah, and one of his arguments uses the example of fire. He says that fire doesn't illuminate itself in the same way it illuminates other things. The object that's being illuminated is in darkness before the fire shines on it, but fire itself doesn't exist in darkness before its own light appears.
That's a really subtle point about illumination.
Yeah, and it actually makes sense when you think about it. But then some of his other arguments in this section, well, they're not as strong from a modern logical standpoint.
Okay, so where does he go wrong?
Well, for example, he argues that if fire illuminates itself in the same way it illuminates other things, then it should also be able to burn itself in the same way it burns other things. And since fire doesn't burn itself, he concludes it can't illuminate itself either.
That does seem like a leap in logic.
Yeah, it relies on this assumption that if something has one kind of relationship to both itself and other things, it must have every kind of relationship in the same way. And when you try to make that argument more formal, spell it out deductively, it doesn't really hold up.
Right, so the analogy breaks down.
Exactly. And he does something similar with darkness. He says, if fire illuminates itself and other things, then darkness, which is the opposite of fire, should be able to hide itself and other things, which we don't see happening. So he's arguing by dissimilarity, but again, it's not super convincing from a deductive standpoint.
So even in these early foundational texts, we can see that there are these glimmers of logical thinking, but they're not always fully developed or applied consistently. They're using analogies, sometimes really cleverly, and sometimes in ways that seem less rigorous to us today.
Absolutely. It's this fascinating mix of insight and, well, some arguments that wouldn't pass muster in a modern logic course. But it shows us how those ideas were evolving, how they were grappling with those fundamental questions about reasoning.
Now let's shift our focus to texts that specifically discuss inference, known as anumana, as pramana, one of those reliable ways of knowing. We see this emerging more explicitly now.
Right, and there are these 4 key texts from this period that really engage with this idea of inference. We have the Vaishika Sutra, the Spitzer manuscript, which is just a fragment, unfortunately, the Sagdi Nirmokana Sutra, and the A Tantra.
Okay, a lot to unpack there.
There is. So let's start with the Vaishika Sutra. It's this early and really important text in the Vaishika school, and it mentions inference as being based on 5 different types of relations between something you observe and something you're trying to infer, something you don't directly observe. But here's the thing, the text doesn't actually give any examples of these relations, so it's kind of up in the air how exactly they're supposed to work.
So it's more of a theoretical framework without the concrete application.
Exactly. But then we have the Spitzer manuscript. It's incomplete, which is a bummer, but it does give us 6 specific examples of inference. And this is within a broader discussion of those 4 recognized pramas: perception, inference, analogy, and tradition. But even with these examples, scholars have to do some reconstruction to figure out the intended logical structure.
Ah, so putting those pieces together like a puzzle.
Yeah, exactly. Then there's the Sagdi Nirmokana Sutra, a key early Mahayana Buddhist scripture, which also mentions these same 4 pramakas, including inference.
So there's a kind of consensus emerging across different schools of thought.
Absolutely. There's definitely some common ground. And finally, we have the A Tantra, one of those foundational texts of the Seiki school. And it defines inference as establishing something unknown based on its relation to something you directly perceive. It even lists 6 types of relations that can lead to a valid inference: master-servant, matter-alteration, part-whole, cause-effect, source-product, association, and incompatibility. But get this, even though they categorize these relations so specifically, the surviving fragments of the A Tantra don't have any actual examples of inferences using them.
So another case of the theory without the practical demonstration.
Yeah, it's frustrating, but that's what makes studying these ancient texts so interesting, right? Always more to uncover. But from these discussions, we can start to see this shared understanding of how inference works. You have a proposition saying that something, let's call it P, has some property S. Then you have the reason, which is that P also has another property, H. And the crucial part is this relationship that's assumed to hold between things that have H and things that have S. It's a real foundational step towards a more structured and clear idea of inference.
And alongside these developments, we also start seeing texts that engage with this concept of argument itself, what they called sadhana. And Gautama's Nyāya Sutra is a big one here.
Oh yeah, definitely a landmark text. It's one of the most influential Brahmanical treatises on epistemology and the principles of debate. But it's also really challenging because it's written in these super short aphoristic statements that are open to interpretation.
So a real puzzle box for scholars?
Totally. But it's a puzzle box worth trying to unlock.
Now, Nagarjuna's Vaidya Prakarana is also interesting in relation to the Nyāya Sutra. It's actually structured around a critique of those key terms introduced right at the beginning of the Nyāya Sutra. But instead of just explaining or illustrating those terms, he uses analogical arguments and critiques based on ideas like circularity and infinite regress to try and show they don't make sense.
Yeah, a real head-on philosophical engagement.
And what's also cool is that these discussions about logic and knowledge, they weren't just happening in these purely philosophical texts.
Right, like the Karaka Sahita, an early medical text, dives into inference, the different premises, and even has a whole section on what makes a sound argument.
Yeah.
It shows you how these ideas about reasoning were really permeating all kinds of intellectual disciplines.
So this wasn't just some niche philosophical pursuit. It was connected to how they thought about everything.
Absolutely. And then you have these Buddhist texts, like the Satinirmakana Sutra and Asaga's Abhidharma Samakaya, which list and define all these terms used in debates.
More of a cataloging approach.
You could say that, yeah. And then the Yogacara Vuijastra takes it a step further by giving about 50 examples of what they consider common sense inferences. They categorize them based on the underlying relation, like inferring fire from smoke or a lion from its roar. But it's not always crystal clear what makes those inferences logically sound.
Right, so we see those seeds of formal logic, but they're not fully developed yet.
Exactly. And then there are these other works attributed to Asaga. Oh, and we can't forget the Fanbian Sin Lun, also known as the Upayahodaya. This one's anonymous, but it's really important because it seems to be the very first text entirely dedicated to the study of argument and inference. A whole book just on that.
So logic was finally getting its own spotlight.
It was. And then we have Vasubandhu, another super influential figure. He wrote a lot about debate, although some of those works, like the Vadahedaya, Vadavidana, and Vadavidi, are lost now. But we do have his Chinese text, the Rushilun, or Tarkashastra, which means treatise on logic.
Okay, so logic is becoming its own established field of study. And this brings us to a pivotal moment. The appearance of a standardized syllogism, a formal structure for argument. The earliest one we know of is actually in the Karaka Sahita, and it's analogical.
That's right. It's this 5-part argument trying to establish the eternality of the soul. It goes like this. Proposition. The soul is eternal. Reason. Because it is unproduced. Example. Space is unproduced, and it is eternal. Application. And just as space is unproduced, so is the soul. Conclusion. Therefore, the soul is eternal. So it's leaning heavily on this idea that the soul and space are similar because they're both unproduced.
Right, so the argument hinges on that analogy. And Matsyana, in his Nyāya, a commentary on the Nyāya Sutra, he also reconstructs 2 types of analogical syllogisms, one based on similarity and the other on dissimilarity. So we see this focus on analogy continuing.
Definitely. And the Fangbian Jinlun seems to be on board with analogical arguments too. It says an argument is complete if it has a reason, proposition, and example, and all the examples they give rely on finding similarities between cases.
So analogy is still king at this point.
It seems so. But here's where things get really interesting. The Fangbian Jinlun actually presents this 5-part syllogism that looks deductively valid. It argues, proposition. The self is eternal. Reason, because it is not perceptible by the senses. Example, space, because of not being perceptible by the senses, is eternal. Everything which is not perceptible by the senses is eternal. Application. And the self is not perceptible by the senses. Conclusion. Could the self possibly be non-eternal? But here's the kicker. Even though it seems logically sound, they reject this very syllogism.
Wow, so they're presenting a deductively valid argument and then saying, nope, we don't buy it.
Exactly. It really shows how they were wrestling with this idea of validity, how they were trying to figure out what makes an argument truly convincing, not just in terms of form, but also in terms of content.
Right, so the relationship between logic and epistemology is really coming to the forefront.
Totally. And then we have the Rushilun. It completely flips things around. It explicitly champions deductively valid syllogisms and rejects those based on analogy.
So a real turning point.
Yeah, big one. And they even give this example of an indolent analogical syllogism about sound not being eternal because it's produced by effort, just like a clay pot. Then they offer a deductively valid version that includes this universal premise. If something is eternal, it doesn't arise from effort, like space.
So they're really emphasizing that necessary connection.
Absolutely. And the Rushilun also lays out those 3 crucial conditions, or trirupa, for a valid reason. It has to be a property of the subject, present in similar things and absent in dissimilar things. This is a huge step towards a formalized system of deductive logic.
And Vasubandhu's Vadavidi also presents a simplified, deductively valid syllogism with just a proposition, reason, and example. The example states this avina-bhava relation, this idea of necessary co-presence between properties.
Right, so we're seeing a real shift from analogy to these deductively valid syllogistic arguments during this classical period. And alongside this, there's also a growing awareness of fallacies, those mistakes in reasoning, and how to spot them.
Right, the Karaka Samhita talks about defective arguments, and both the Nyāya Sutra and Fangbyan Sinlin give us these lists of fallacious rejoinders called jati.
Yeah, although the Fangbyan Sinlin sometimes treats these jatis as clever counter-arguments instead of actual flaws, which is interesting.
But in the Rushilun and Vadavidi, they're definitely seen as weaknesses.
Right, and then you have the Vayasika Sutra and Nyāya Sutra introducing those specious reasons, or hetpapasa. At first, they don't really explain them much, but later texts like the Karaka Samhita, Vadavidi, and Rushilun give more detailed discussions and examples.
So they're really starting to dissect those logical missteps.
They are, and they also talk about grounds for defeat, nigrahaskana, in debates, like those specific behaviors or failures in argument that would make you lose a debate. The Nyāya Sutra, Rushilun, Karaka Samhita, and Asaga's Hetuvidya all classify these debate-ending blunders.
So a real focus on the rules of the game, so to speak.
Exactly, how to play fair, and how to recognize when someone's not playing by the rules. And this brings us to the culmination of the classical period, around the 5th and 6th century CE, where we have Dignaga. He's a monumental figure who really solidified and expanded our understanding of deductive logic, building on Vasubandhu's work.
Okay, so Dignaga is the big name here.
He is, yeah. His contributions to logic are immense, even though a lot of his original Sanskrit writings, like the Nyāya Hetukakra Kamaru, and his main work, the Pramāta-samukaya, mostly survive in Chinese and Tibetan translations. But we know how influential he was because later Indian logicians constantly refer to him in their commentaries and citations.
So his ideas had a huge impact. What were some of his key insights?
Well, one of the really brilliant things Dignaga did was explicitly connect that mental process of inference with how it's expressed in a syllogism. He introduced these terms, svratha anumana, which means inference for oneself, that internal process of reaching a conclusion, and parartha anumana, which is inference for others, the way you articulate that inference to convince someone else.
So he's recognizing that logic isn't just about these abstract structures, it's about how our minds actually work.
Yeah, and how we communicate those thoughts to others. And he also expanded Vasubandhu's syllogism by adding two elements, a similarity example and a dissimilarity example. The typical deductively valid syllogism attributed to Dignaga looks something like this, using the example of sound being non-eternal. Thesis: sound is non-eternal. Reason: because it is always accompanied by effort. Similarity example: whatever is always accompanied by effort is observed to be non-eternal, like a pot. Dissimilarity example: whatever is eternal is observed not to be always accompanied by effort, like space.
Okay, so a lot more complexity than that earlier three-part syllogism.
Definitely. And Dignaga uses the term paka for the thesis, which is interesting because it has all these interconnected meanings. It can be the statement itself, the actual situation the statement describes, the grammatical subject, and even the thing that subject refers to. It shows how intertwined language, thought, and reality are in their logic.
Right. It's not just about manipulating symbols, it's about understanding the world.
Exactly. And there's this other thing that sparked a lot of debate among scholars. Dignaga adds the word observed to those universal statements in both examples. And this has led to a lot of discussion about whether his logic is purely deductive or if it has some inductive elements in it.
Ah, so that little word observed has big implications.
It does. And then there's Dignaga's Hetukakra, or Wheel of Reasons. It's this 3x3 matrix that helps you evaluate the validity of a reason based on whether it's present or absent in cases that are similar or dissimilar to the subject of the inference. He mapped out which combinations on this matrix represent logically sound and unsound arguments.
So a visual tool for analyzing logic.
Exactly. A really ingenious way to show how those different elements of an argument relate to each other. Now, going back to that debate about whether Dignaga's logic is deductive or inductive, one of the main reasons some people think it might not be purely deductive is that observed in the examples.
Right, like it's suggesting those universal statements are only meant to apply to what we've directly observed, not necessarily to everything.
Right, but the way observed is placed grammatically makes it tricky. It's in the main clause of the examples, not in the part that expresses the universal relationship. So if observed just means we assume what we observe is true, it doesn't really change the basic deductive structure of the premise.
I see. So it depends on how you interpret that word.